a norm that would generate conflict, that creates conflicts, is contrary to the very purpose of a norm or a rule. Or we can also say a norm that creates conflicts is a perversion instead of is what a rule is supposed to do, namely to help us avoid conflicts. And with regard to the purpose of conflict avoidance, then the institution of private property is definitely not just a convention, because no alternative to it exists. Only private or exclusive property makes it possible that all otherwise unavoidable conflicts can be avoided. And only the principle of property acquisition by acts of original appropriation, that is, of appropriating something that was previously unowned, makes it possible that conflicts can be avoided from the beginning of mankind on, so to speak, until its very end. Because the first appropriator of something did not involve anyone in any conflict. He was the first one. Nobody else was there. So the first appropriation of something as private property is a conflict-free way of transferring something that was previously some external thing into something that is private property. Now, the next problem what I want to address is the problem of the enforcement of social order and the protection of private property rights. Now, even if people recognize, so to speak, the validity of the rules that I have explained, and even though we might know how to avoid all conflicts, it is still possible that some people simply do not care. That you say, oh, I know how to avoid conflicts, but I don't want to avoid conflict. I hope to personally benefit by being involved in conflicts with other people. So what every society needs is, of course, also institutions and mechanisms that enforce these rules, that deal with norm breakers, with rule breakers who simply do not behave in a civilized manner. How do we accomplish this task? That is, how do we deal with murderers and rapists and robbers and the normal criminal folks that we are all familiar with? Who is supposed to make sure that these people are brought to order? The standard answer that is given to this question, the answer that is also given, for instance, by Ludwig von Mises to this question is, this is the task of the state. That is, the enforcement of law and order is the first and primary duty of the state. Now, whether this answer is correct or not depends on how is the state defined. And I give you the standard definition of the state, not some crazy definition that I have come up with, but this definition that you find in almost every textbook. What is a state? And the definition is, the state is an agency that is characterized by two unique characteristics. First, the state is an agency that exercises a territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making. In every case of conflict, the state is the institution that decides who is right and who is wrong. And there is no appeal beyond the state. Nobody is above the state. And the implications of this will become clear as I go on. This also means the state is the ultimate arbiter in every case of conflict that involves the state itself. That is, if the state or the state agents are involved in a conflict with other people, the state or agents of the state decide who is right and who is wrong in those types of conflicts also. And the second unique characteristic of the state is a territorial monopolist of taxation. It can unilaterally determine what people must pay to the state for performing this function of being the ultimate judge in every case of conflict. Now, as widespread as the standard view regarding the necessity of the institution of the state as a provider of law and order is, it stands in clear contradiction to elementary economic and moral laws and principles. Let me explain this quickly. Among economists and philosophers, there are two propositions that they almost universally agree to. The first one is, every monopoly is bad from the viewpoint of consumers, not from the viewpoint of the producers. Every producer loves to be a monopolist. But from the viewpoint of consumers, monopolies are bad for the following reason. Monopoly is defined as, in the classical meaning, as a firm that has an exclusive privilege. I, firm A, am the only one who is allowed to produce a certain product. No one else is allowed to produce this product or service except me. Why is that bad from the point of view of consumers? It's easy to predict. It is bad from the viewpoint of consumers because shielded from potential competitors, the price for this good or service will be higher than it otherwise would be, and the quality of this good or service will be lower than it otherwise would be. And the second statement on which almost all philosophers and economists agree is the production of law and order, that is, the enforcement of laws, or the production of security, is the primary function of the state, and the state is defined, as I just explained before, as a territorial monopolist of ultimate decision-making. Now, obviously, both of these statements are incompatible. That is, they contradict each other. Monopoly is bad on the one hand, but for the production of security, we need a monopolist. We need the state. Now, most philosophers and economists don't even bother about this contradiction. They don't seem to be even aware of this contradiction. And if they are made aware of it, or if they somehow themselves recognize there is some contradiction between the two statements, then the usual way out is to say, then there is something wrong with the statement that all monopolies are bad, and we stick to the proposition that law and order must be provided by a monopolist. That is, they find fault not with the first proposition, but not with the second proposition. Instead, I want to just argue it is exactly the other way around. The proposition about monopolies is bad is true. The proposition about the state having to be a monopolist in order to enforce law and order is actually false. As a territorial monopolist of ultimate decision-making and law enforcement, the state is not just like any other monopolist, that is such as a milk monopolist or a car monopolist who produces milk at too high prices and too low quality, or cars at too high prices and too low quality. In contrast to all other monopolists, the state is not only an institution that produces inferior goods, bad goods, low quality goods, but it actually produces bads. That is to say, goods that are not really goods at all, what we call bads. In fact, the state must first produce bads, especially in the form of taxation, which are obviously not a good. I'm not screaming, come on, do me something good and take taxes from me. It's obviously not a good. So the state in order to do anything good at all, or something that looks like it might be a good, must first do something bad in order to then do something good. Now, if an agency is the ultimate judge in every case of conflict, then it is also, as I already indicated, the judge in all cases of conflict involving the state itself. A monopolist of ultimate decision-making then will not just prevent conflicts and arbitrate so that conflicts are resolved. If you can decide who is right and wrong in every case, even in cases involving yourself, then you will provoke and cause conflicts, and then, of course, decide these conflicts in your own favor. To use a drastic example, I hit you on the head, then you complain that, why did you hit me on the head? And then I say, okay, I'm the judge in this case, and I tell you that you looked at me in a very strange way, and I had the feeling that I had to hit you on the head. And now you have to just pay me also on top of it, because I made this very just verdict that you deserved to be hit on the head by myself. It should also be clear that constitutions or Supreme Courts or something like this do not change anything in this regard. Because Supreme Courts or constitutions need to be interpreted also. By whom are they interpreted? They are interpreted by employees of the same organization that caused the conflict in the first case, and it is, of course, predictable that they will, by and large, always decide in favor of the state itself. After all, they are agents of this agency themselves. What we can then predict is, instead of recognizing private property rights and laws that are eternally the same, states will substitute legislation for law. That is, they make the law. They make laws that say, it is all right if I hit you on the head sometimes. In addition, as the ultimate judge, the state is also a monopolist of taxation. That is, it can unilaterally determine, without the consent of those that are affected by it, what its subjects must pay for this service that the state, alleged service that the state provides. In other words, the state is, by definition, an expropriating property protector. You realize that this is obviously a contradiction in terms. And then motivated, like everyone else, by the idea that the more money I can spend, the better off I am, and the less I work, the less I really have to work for something, the better off I am also. It is predictable that the amount of taxes collected will continuously increase, and the protection offered, the protection of life and property by the state, will continuously go down. For the state, the best thing is to maximize expenditure on what they call protection of life and property, and in fact minimize the actual production of protection of life and property.